Gatehouse, stop the woman driving my car. The missing trust papers are only the beginning. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my voice steady with the calm earned the hard way, without ever needing to raise my voice. Below me, Brianna froze, clutching her designer coat to hide the jagged green glint of an emerald brooch. She thought she had found a payday, but she didn't realize she was holding the one item my husband hid for decades. Not for its price, but for what it proved. 2 years after my son Daniel's passing, Brianna had stopped pretending to grieve. Drowning in debt, she treated the Vance estate like her personal bank. The brooch wasn't just jewelry, it carried a story that never belonged in daylight. In the months after Daniel passed, Brianna arrived at my door wearing black and speaking in soft, careful phrases. The kind people use when they want to be seen as good. I wanted to believe her. Leo wanted to believe her even more. But grief has a way of sharpening instincts, and mine kept catching on little inconsistencies. Bills hidden under cookbooks, late-night phone calls that stopped the moment I walked in, and the way she asked about my health before she asked about Leo's schoolwork. I spent most of my life running a school. You learn quickly that the loudest student isn't always the most dangerous. It's the quiet one who watches, waits, and figures out where the adults are weakest. Brianna watched me the same way. When my breathing worsened, she didn't bring comfort. She brought clipboards. When my hands shook, she didn't bring a warm drink out of kindness. She brought it like a routine. So I started keeping my own records, not dramatic diaries. Simple notes, dates, times, what she said, what she did, and what changed afterward. I tightened my routines, I moved key documents. I taught Leo that if something feels wrong, you tell me, even if you're scared. He was only a child, but he was Daniel's child, observant, earnest, and braver than Brianna ever gave him credit for. That evening, she brought me a tray with my usual cup, her eyes flicking from the trust folder to the calendar as if she were timing paperwork, not checking on me. As I reached for it, my grandson Leo leaned close and whispered, "Don't touch it yet, Grandma." He'd watched her switch the tray positions and take a quick photo afterward, like she was trying to manufacture a moment she could point to later. My heart slammed hard enough to rattle my ribs, but I didn't let my face change. I let Brianna believe I was fading, a relic whose memory was slipping like sand. She wanted the fortune, and she assumed time would do the dirty work for her. She never understood that patience is power, and that a legacy built on truth doesn't get handed over to the loudest liar. This house, once filled with Daniel's laughter, had turned into a quiet battlefield. Brianna thought she was the hunter, but she had misread the matriarch and the rules of this home. When she finally found the brooch, she thought she'd outsmarted an old woman. What she actually did was pick up the bait Daniel and I left behind on purpose. For months I watched her move through the halls like a shadow, her greed blinding her to the small choices I made. A drawer left slightly ajar, a floorboard loosened by a hair, a missing key placed where only the careless would ignore it. My age and my breathing aid weren't weaknesses, they were cover. The Vance legacy was never about gold bars or real estate. It was about a father's love and a grandmother's promise to protect the next generation. And now Brianna was halfway down the driveway, my car in her hands, my family's history in her pocket, and a sealed packet pried from beneath the oak boards. If she thought she was escaping, she was wrong. She was running straight into the end of her own story. I didn't need Brianna to admit anything. I only needed her to do what greedy people always do. Take the bait, move fast, and forget who has been watching the whole time. The silver tray sat on my desk like a silent accusation. I looked at the steaming mug, then at the calendar on the wall, and finally at Brianna's reflection in the glass of the framed photo on my desk. My chest tightened into a familiar band of pain. A reminder that Brianna treated my time like a countdown she was eager to finish. She wasn't hiding her intentions anymore. Every glance felt like a deadline. Her eyes flickered from my face to the trust binder, then to the calendar, as if she could pencil in the day she'd take over what my son built. She didn't look at me like family. She looked past me, at the estate. "You haven't touched your drink, Eleanor," Brianna said, appearing in the doorway. She was scrolling on her phone, bored until her eyes caught the empty velvet box on my desk. It's getting cold. You know how much you need your rest. I took a shallow breath and let the concentrator's soft hiss fill the silence. I was thinking about Daniel, I replied, my voice raspy but steady. He always said character is the only asset you can't replace. So he built a safeguard into the trust. A simple rule that disqualifies any beneficiary the moment they try to take what isn't theirs. Brianna's face tightened. Decency was a foreign language to her, something meant for other people. She walked over and placed a blue-bound folder on top of my journals. Authorization forms, neat paper meant to turn my voice into a signature she could control. Saul mentioned your memory has been slipping, she lied, sweetness dripping over every word. We should secure your affairs, for Leo's sake. She was trying to play the long game, unaware that I was the one who had written the rules long before she arrived. I studied the papers, then her manicured hands. She believed I was already half gone, a senile woman drowning in a fog she assumed grief and age created. But I'd heard every excuse, and I knew how to let a story collapse under its own weight. I watched her eyes dart toward the loosened floorboard. She thought she was the hunter. I was the one setting the trap. I'll sign, I whispered, and watched triumph flare behind her lashes, but only after I finished my cup. I lifted the mug, letting the warmth soak into my fingers. I didn't drink. I watched her reflection in the darkened window and listened to the tiny sounds she couldn't control. Her breath, her impatience, the tap of her nails. For a second, she leaned just slightly toward the floor, like a magnet pulled by metal. She couldn't help herself. Greed always reaches first. I traced the rim of the mug and noticed a faint fingerprint smudge, like someone had handled it twice. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the spoon. But the point wasn't the cup. The point was the pattern. Brianna's kindness arrived with conditions. Every helpful act came with paperwork, witnesses, or a phone call she wanted recorded. Frank used to call it the theater of virtue, when someone performs goodness because the performance is profitable. Brianna performed grief the same way. And I was done applauding. Then Leo's voice crackled through the baby monitor hidden under my desk, a device he used to record the ghosts in the hallway. "Grandma," he whispered, "the man in the suit is here." Brianna flinched. She didn't realize Saul wasn't coming for a routine check-in. He was coming for the truth she was trying to bury. The air still held the scent of lilies, but for the first time in 2 years, it felt like the house had room for oxygen again. The emerald brooch wasn't a trinket, it was bait, and she had already swallowed it whole. Saul Henderson stepped into the foyer, removing his dark overcoat and setting his briefcase on the entry table. A faint scent of cedar followed him into the warm air of the Vance estate. Brianna's face transformed instantly. The sharp glint I'd seen moments ago vanished, replaced by weary, dutiful sorrow. She tucked the authorization folder under her arm, but her other hand stayed clenched around her coat pocket, where I knew the emerald brooch lay hidden. "Saul, thank you for coming on such short notice," Brianna said, her voice a practiced, breathy whisper. She reached out, as if to take his coat, but Saul bypassed her, his eyes fixed on me. "Eleanor's memory. It's been a difficult afternoon. We were just discussing the necessity of securing her affairs. She's been so confused lately, haven't you, Eleanor?" I didn't answer. I simply watched him. Saul walked straight to my walnut desk, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He looked at the half-empty mug, then at the sealed packet I'd set aside, as if he were measuring what Brianna thought she could get away with. A grim, knowing smile touched his lips as he adjusted his spectacles. "Memory is a funny thing, Brianna," Saul said, voice calm and clear. "Sometimes we forget the small things, like where we put our reading glasses. And sometimes we remember the big things, like why a certain piece of jewelry was buried under 3 inches of oak and sealed tight 40 years ago." I saw the color drain from Brianna's face. She didn't realize Saul wasn't just the family lawyer. He was the keeper of the Vance family's quiet history. He had been there the night my husband Frank came home with shaking hands and a torn coat, refusing to explain until he was sure the doors were locked. Frank never liked to talk about that night. He only said one line, once: "If the wrong person finds it, they will rewrite what happened." After Frank passed, Daniel asked Saul to keep that archived file close. Daniel wasn't sentimental about objects, but he was fiercely protective of truth. If anything ever happens to me, he told Saul, make sure Mom and Leo are protected, not just financially, morally. I don't want my name used to justify someone else's greed. Those words came back to me now, as Brianna shifted her weight and tried to look innocent. She didn't understand that Daniel had planned for her long before she showed her real face. I'm not sure what you're implying, Saul, Brianna stammered, fingers twitching near her pocket. I'm just trying to protect this family from the debts Daniel left behind. Saul opened his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a single, grainy black and white document. It wasn't a bank statement or a deed. It was an archived file from Seattle, dated nearly 30 years ago. Attached to the corner was a photograph of an emerald brooch, the very one Brianna had pried from the floorboard. In the photo, the green stones were blurred by dark, crusted marks. People searched for this missing heirloom for months, Saul said quietly, his gaze sharp. Not because it was pretty, because it mattered. Frank didn't hide it to hoard it, he hid it to keep the truth from being twisted in the wrong hands. Saul paused, letting the words settle. Tonight, you didn't just find a payday. You found a reckoning you can't bargain with. The room seemed to chill. Brianna took a step back, breath coming in ragged gasps. She realized her greed had led her into a tomb, not a vault. You're bluffing, she hissed, the mask finally cracking. You're just a tired old man trying to hoard Daniel's money. Daniel didn't leave you money, Brianna? I said, standing and pulling my oxygen tube aside for a moment of pure defiance. He left you a choice, and you just chose the wrong side of it. The silence that followed was heavy. Brianna's hand stayed on her pocket like it was a lifeline, and I knew she was already planning her next move. The old glass hummed in its frame as the house settled. Brianna stood trembling, her hand frozen near the pocket where the emerald brooch weighed like a curse. Saul Henderson didn't move. He simply watched her, the archived file open on the desk like a doorway she couldn't close. Brianna whispered that he was lying, claiming this was a setup to scare her into signing away her rights. Then she turned to me, eyes bright with a frantic, hungry light. She begged me to tell Saul he was wrong, crying about how much she had sacrificed for this family. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't see my daughter-in-law. I saw a woman who had finally run out of excuses. I didn't need to speak. Leo stepped into the dim light with his digital recorder, hands small but steady. He pressed play. Brianna's voice filled the room, stripped of its artificial sweetness. The recording caught her laughing about how easy it was to rewrite a story if you controlled the proof. She admitted she'd been staging small moments with my drink, and that green pin, not to help me, but to build a file that made me look inconsistent. She bragged that I'd blame stress, never realizing she was planting doubt so she could label me unfit and take control of everything. I felt Leo's shoulder brush my arm, the smallest tremor of fear he was trying hard to hide. That tremor hardened into steel inside me. Brianna's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at her son, the child she treated like a prop, and saw the truth reflected back. Leo walked to Saul and handed him the recorder. Then he added quietly that he'd found an amber bottle tucked behind old holiday decorations, something Brianna had no reason to be storing. She'd kept insisting it belonged in my drink. Saul's expression didn't shift. This isn't a misunderstanding, he said, calm as stone. He named it for what it was: pressure, manipulation, and a deliberate attempt to intimidate a child into staying quiet. Then he did something Brianna never expected. He looked at Leo first, not her, and thanked him for being brave. Brianna tried to pivot, she tried to cry, she tried to bargain, but she was running out of rooms to perform in. Outside, the street was quiet, but inside, the balance had already shifted. Brianna realized she wasn't facing my anger. She was facing the rules, and the proof she couldn't talk her way around. Brianna tried to lunge for the recorder, but Saul held up a hand, and she stopped. Not from respect, but from calculation. She knew movement would be noticed. She knew witnesses mattered. That's how she played life, always thinking one step ahead, always believing everyone else was slower. Leo stood beside me, face pale but eyes locked forward. I put my hand on his shoulder and felt him steady under my palm. He had done the hardest part already. He had told the truth in a house that punished truth. Saul didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated what would happen next. The trust documents would be reviewed, the audio would be preserved, and Brianna would no longer be left alone with me or with Leo. Her access to accounts and records would be paused until everything was clear. In other words, the stage was being dismantled while she was still trying to perform. And that was when her eyes flicked to the hallway, calculating, not remorseful. Calculating. I knew exactly what she would try next. A hard weather front rolled over Seattle, and the house made its own small noises as it cooled. Wood settling, pipes ticking, floorboards complaining. I lay in bed and kept my breathing shallow, and even as the door handle turned with a soft click, Brianna slipped into the room with no hesitation, no reverence. She didn't look like a grieving widow. She looked like someone who had already rehearsed the moment she would take what she wanted and walk away. Her hand hovered near my collar as she leaned in, and my pulse jumped so sharply the monitor blinked. I stayed still. Silence is a skill. Sometimes it's the only way to let a liar reveal themselves without being interrupted by your fear. She unclasped the shattered emerald brooch from my nightstand and reached into the drawer for the leather pouch. To her, these were keys to a kingdom. To me, they were bait and a receipt. Finally, she whispered into the dark, triumph rough in her voice. "Goodbye, Grandma." People ask later why I didn't confront her sooner, why I didn't scream, why I didn't call for help the moment I heard her footsteps. The answer is simple. Confrontation is what manipulators want. It gives them noise to hide behind. Brianna would have cried, blamed stress, told everyone I was confused. She would have turned my fear into her proof. So I gave her quiet, I gave her space, and I let her hang herself on her own choices. She vanished down the hall. Moments later, I heard the engine flare in the driveway and fade into the night. I sat up slowly, chest tightening, but my mind sharpening. The hallway's silence told me Leo was where he should be, safe in Saul's study, out of reach of Brianna's mood swings, sudden sweetness, and whispered threats. I picked up the landline with fingers steadier than my lungs had any right to be. "Miller," I said when he answered. Miller wasn't law enforcement. He was our family's security coordinator. The man Frank trusted when something felt off but didn't belong on paper. "She's gone. She's in my car. She took the sealed packet and the brooch. Don't confront her alone. She's already been pressuring a child." There was a pause, then Miller exhaled. "Eleanor, if she has that brooch, she's carrying something your husband hid for a reason. Once we move, she can't pretend it's all a misunderstanding." "She made her choice," I replied, looking out at the street where the neighborhood lights blurred in the moisture. "She thinks she's driving toward a payday. She doesn't realize she's driving into a truth." Daniel and I prepared for the moment we saw her start rewriting my days. "I won't chase her. I'll let her run into the end of her own story." I set the phone down and listened to the house breathe. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was how quickly she believed she could erase Daniel with a signature. That ended tonight. In the next room, Leo murmured to Saul, asking if his mother would come back. Saul's answer was soft but firm. "Not the way she expects." And I knew the night was about to turn. The house's quiet broke with the jagged screech of my scanner. I sat in my study, the untouched drink long cold, when Miller's voice came through the line, clipped, steady, careful. "Car found," he said. "The packet is recovered." Brianna hadn't just lost control of my car, she'd lost control of her narrative. She believed she was escaping with a fortune, unaware that every choice she made that night was leaving a trail she couldn't sweep away. The stakes were never only money. They were Leo's safety, Daniel's name, and the truth Brianna thought she could bury under paperwork and performance. "I don't need a long report," I told Miller. My voice surprised even me, sharp, calm, certain. "Is she safe?" "Yes," he said, shaken, loud, still trying to talk her way out of it. "We found the car by the roadside. The packet and brooch are secure." "Of course she is," I murmured. I closed my eyes and pictured her clutching the brooch like it was luck. "Bring everything back to Saul," I said. "Keep her away from Leo. No conversations with the child. No last-minute apologies. No tears that turn into pressure." Miller paused. "Understood. We'll handle it quietly." When I hung up, the tightness in my chest loosened a fraction. For 2 years, I'd lived in the shadow of Brianna's greed, watching her turn Daniel's memory into a bargaining chip. She called me a dying relic when she thought I couldn't hear. She never understood that patience is power, the ability to wait until someone steps so far into their own lie that they can't back out. Leo stood in the doorway, watching me like he was measuring whether I would collapse. I held his gaze and nodded once. No speeches, no grand gestures. Just the quiet message. You're safe, and I'm still here. Outside, the moisture in the air softened the streetlights into halos. Inside, the house felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for the truth to finally be spoken out loud. I walked to the window and rested my palm against the cool glass. Your dad was right, I whispered, not to the night, but to the memory of Daniel. Integrity is the only currency that matters. An hour later, Saul brought the sealed packet back to my study and placed it on the desk as if it were fragile. He didn't open it right away. He looked at me first. Are you sure you want to see it tonight? He asked. I've been seeing it for 2 years, I replied. Just not in daylight. When he finally broke the seal, the brooch lay inside in 2 jagged pieces, the green stones still catching light like they were proud of what they'd done. Beneath it was the archived file, edges worn, a silent reminder that some truths survive simply because someone refuses to throw them away. Leo watched from the doorway. I told him he didn't need to look if he didn't want to. He looked anyway. That was Daniel in him, the courage to face reality, even when it hurts. Then I turned back toward the study. The next step wasn't revenge, it was protection. And it had to be done cleanly. I pushed back the private exam room curtain with steady calm. Brianna lay propped on the bed, face smeared with mud and mascara, clutching the leather pouch to her chest like it could rewrite reality. She didn't look heartbroken, she looked cornered, a performer who suddenly realized the audience had stopped believing her. The moment she saw me, she reached for victimhood. She claimed intruders had broken in. She claimed she was saving the inheritance. She said she was driving the trust papers to the bank for safekeeping when the trip ended in a roadside incident. Then she begged me to tell everyone who asked that she was doing it for Leo. Brianna tried to talk over Saul, over me, over the nurse who adjusted her blanket. She kept repeating that everything had been so hard for her since Daniel passed, as if difficulty excused decisions. I listened without interrupting. I was thinking about the real timeline. 2 years since Daniel's passing. 2 years of Brianna living under my roof. 2 years of Leo learning to be quiet to avoid triggering her moods. Tonight wasn't the start of her behavior. It was simply the night the behavior ran out of hiding places. The lie was so hollow, it thinned the air. Saul Henderson stood near the monitor, eyes sharp. He let out a short, dry laugh, and noted she was found miles from any bank, heading in the opposite direction in the middle of the night. Brianna's story wasn't protection. It was panic with better wording. Saul told her to look at what she'd risked everything to take. With trembling fingers, Brianna ripped open the leather pouch. She expected the notarized Vance family trust. Instead, she pulled out an archived report from the 1990s, and Frank's handwritten statement clipped to it. The triumph drained from her eyes, replaced by a blank fear. Her grip tightened so hard her knuckles went pale. I watched her swallow. In that instant, she understood she'd grabbed the wrong thing. She'd chased the shiny object and missed the real target. The trust papers were already safe, placed away months ago. What she had taken was a piece of our family's buried history, the kind of history that turns greed into a trap. And the brooch? Saul asked, voice level. Brianna's eyes flicked to her pocket. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The shape of it was already telling the truth. I leaned in and spoke softly, so only she could hear. You wanted a shortcut, I said. Now you have one. It leads straight to the end. For the first time since Daniel passed, Brianna looked at me without a mask. Not with grief, with fear. As Saul tucked the archived report back into his briefcase, Brianna whispered one line that made my skin go cold. She said she knew where Daniel kept the real papers, and I realized she still believed there was one more door she could force open. The meeting room was a plain box of white light. I sat behind the glass in the adjoining room, hands folded, stillness earned by years of staying quiet until the truth shows itself. On the other side, Brianna looked disheveled. Her designer coat was rumpled, her hair stiff from a long night, and her eyes kept darting toward the sealed packet on the table, the shattered emerald brooch inside it, like a problem that wouldn't stop existing. Saul Henderson stepped in and set his leather briefcase down with a quiet thud. He laid out the documents with methodical care. He explained, without drama, without raised voice, that the brooch wasn't just an heirloom. The markings on it matched lab records tied to an old, long-buried matter Frank never wanted turned into gossip. Brianna's breathing went shallow. She snapped that she didn't do anything and tried to blame me for keeping it hidden. Saul didn't argue. He reached into his pocket and placed Leo's digital recorder on the table. "We don't need your version," he said evenly. "We already have your words." The file played. Brianna's laugh, her plan. The way she'd been staging little proof moments around the house, quick photos, notes, and that green pin, just enough to point to later. She wanted me labeled unfit so she could move fast and sell what wasn't hers. She talked about Leo as if he were furniture in the wrong room, something to relocate. I felt my jaw tighten. Behind the glass, my hands stayed folded. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my anger. For a second, Brianna's face did something honest. It tightened, like a person realizing the script had flipped. Saul leaned in for the final strike, but he kept it simple. He reminded her of the trust clause Daniel and I added, the safeguard that disqualifies any beneficiary who tries to gain control through fraud, manipulation, or exploitation of my condition. Brianna stared at the recorder, then at the packet, then at Saul. She wasn't inheriting a fortune. She was inheriting the price of her own choices. "And the boy?" she snapped suddenly, trying for one last lever. "He's mine." Saul's gaze didn't blink. "He isn't property," he said. "And he isn't your shield." Brianna tried to pivot again, claiming she was only doing what any mother would do. Saul asked one simple question. "Then why were you planning to leave without your son?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer that didn't expose her. He slid a printed timeline across the table. Not dramatic, just factual. Dates of account logins. Times she requested my signature. The day she ordered the authorization folder. The night Leo recorded her. Patterns don't care about excuses. Behind the glass, I watched her eyes flicker as she realized she was no longer in control of what people believed. Silence filled the room. Thick and unmovable. For the first time, Brianna looked afraid of quiet, because quiet meant she couldn't talk her way out. 3 days after Brianna's greed finally ran out of room to move, the air in our home felt clear enough to breathe. The house was no longer a cage of secrets. It was a library of memories waiting to be read. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, one hand on the smooth railing. Saul stood beside me, his usual sharp wit replaced by a quiet, reverent focus. Leo wore his father's oversized flannel, his small hand tucked into mine like a promise. We descended into the cool, cedar-scented depths of the cellar. At the far end, hidden behind a false wall of old crates, stood the heavy steel door my husband commissioned 40 years ago. It didn't look like a bank vault. It looked like a threshold. I pulled the silver locket, the one Brianna ignored in her feverish hunt, from my pocket. While she chased the sparkle of an old story, she overlooked the key resting in plain sight. I pressed the locket into the circular indentation. Gears stirred. A deep thrum rolled through the metal, like a heart waking after a long sleep. With a hiss of air, the door eased open. Inside was something far more precious than cash. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound research journals, careful prototypes, and rolls of blueprints. Leo gasped and ran to a workbench where a half-finished nanofiltration model sat under fine dust. "It's Dad's workshop," he whispered, tracing Daniel's jagged handwriting in an open notebook. "He never showed me this. He wanted to," I said softly, "but he wanted you safe more." In that moment, I understood how small Brianna's imagination was. She dreamed of luxury cars and quick exits. She never saw the real treasure, Daniel's life's work. The licensing rights for even one of these designs could sustain Leo for decades. Not as a payout, as a purpose. A legacy that builds instead of consumes. Saul's voice softened. "Eleanor, this isn't just inheritance, it's impact." On one shelf, Saul found the original licensing drafts Daniel had been negotiating. They weren't worth millions because of hype. They were worth millions because the work was real. Daniel had written, in the margin, for Leo, so he never feels owned by anyone's moods. I ran my finger over the ink and felt grief and pride collide in my chest. Brianna wanted money without meaning. Daniel built meaning that could fund itself. Leo found a photo tucked inside one of the journals. Daniel in safety goggles, laughing, one arm around Leo when he was smaller. Leo pressed the photo to his chest like it was oxygen. I watched him and I felt the final weight lift. Betrayal is a shadow, but this light was permanent. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Not the old tense quiet that tastes like fear. A clean quiet. The kind you can finally sleep in. The final decision arrived on a crisp morning. I sat in the front row of the review room, back straight, hands folded. Brianna sat at the front table, her designer suits replaced by a plain outfit that made her look small and hollow. She no longer looked like the socialite who invaded my home. She looked like someone who finally understood the price. The chairperson entered, and the room settled into a heavy hush. Brianna's representative tried to argue that she had been confused, that stress had made her careless, that everyone should show compassion. Saul Henderson stood beside me, calm and unshakable. He presented the digital recorder without theatrics. He played the file, and the room filled with Brianna's own voice, laughing about how she'd been staging my decline. No one needed a speech after that. The chairperson reviewed the trust clause, the safeguard Daniel and I added. The finding was simple. Brianna's actions violated the trust's good faith requirement. She was disqualified from receiving any portion of the estate. The money she had fixated on was redirected into the Vance Innovation Foundation, a legacy of life-saving technology built from Daniel's work. No one used harsh words. They didn't need to. Brianna's own recording had already done the heavy lifting. The chairperson's final note was simple. Trust is a relationship, and Brianna had broken it. She could appeal, she could complain, she could post her version online, but she couldn't change what she'd said in her own voice. As she stood to leave, she looked at Leo and tried one last soft smile, the kind that used to work. Leo didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply held the blueprints tighter. That was his answer. Brianna looked at me with jagged, emerald green envy, but I didn't look away. I was no longer the woman she tried to manage. I was the woman who refused to be erased. When she was escorted out, the hush that followed felt louder than any slammed door. Outside, Seattle sunlight broke through the gray. Leo waited for me, clutching his father's blueprints. The shattered emerald brooch remained sealed in the family archive as a reminder of a past we didn't have to repeat. Leo asked it was over. I took a deep, effortless breath and told him yes, and that our real life was beginning. In the weeks after the decision, our home turned back into a sanctuary. I sat on the porch as Leo sketched new designs beside the lavender in bloom. The bitter memory of those afternoons faded into a distant shadow. I realized then that the greatest inheritance isn't what you gather. It's what you protect, and what you choose not to let bitterness destroy. Saul often says a clear conscience is a soft pillow. That night, it finally felt soft. Daniel and I built this legacy of truth long before he passed, ensuring the Vance name remained a symbol of honor. And as evening stretched across the garden, I looked at the final envelope Saul left on my desk, the one Daniel kept hidden until the moment the house was safe again. It held one last revelation about where this story truly began. If you're ready for the final piece of the puzzle, it's waiting for you on your screen now.